Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's IDIS Setup and Draw Instructions for ESG CARES Act Grants webinar. My name is Tommy Joe Bednar, and I'm going to be covering just a few pieces of logistical and housekeeping information before we get started today. So first and foremost, I want to let you all know that today's webinar is being recorded, and that recording, along with all the materials, including the slides, a copy of the chat, and the Q&A, will be made available and posted to the HUD Exchange. So give us about 2 to 3 business days to make sure that those are accessible and posted. So they will be available on the HUD Exchange, and other information for other webinars and office hours can also be found on the HUD Exchange. We also hope that you can hear us right now and that you have a great audio connection, but we know that better audio and audio issues can happen. So for best audio, we suggest that you connect to audio via the phone number included on the screen, and I'm going to pop that in the chat for you all right now so that you can join. And again, that just provides a little bit better quality. Speaking of that chat, on this webinar, we do hope that you will share questions, experiences, ask questions of our wonderful panelists today, make comments on the information and the content that's going to be shared. So to do so, we hope that you'll use the chat feature. And to open the chat feature, as shown in the screenshot on the screen now, you can see that little chat button with a little chat bubble in the bottom right-hand corner. If you click on that, that'll open the chat pane for you. Please make sure that all of your messages are addressed to everyone in the Tune line. That will make sure that all of our wonderful panelists and your fellow attendees can see all of your messages and all of your questions today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Chris Pitcher. Chris?
Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Tommy Joe. It is my pleasure to be with you today to talk to you about IDIS. My name is Chris Pitcher. I work for ICF, a HUD technical assistance provider. I'm pleased to be joined by my fellow presenters and resource advisors today. So we have, speaking with you about IDIS for ESG-CV, Marlisa Grogan from the SNAPS office, and Heidi Schilp, also from another technical assistance provider, the Cloudburst Group. Nora Lally from Homebase will be helping us with questions and answers. And we have Ben Stern from Cloudburst and Mandy Wampler from the Philadelphia Field Office helping us manage the chat and question and answer box today. So thank you for all of you for joining us for this wonderful webinar. Next slide. I'm going to walk us through the objectives for this webinar for this afternoon session. First, we'll review the IDIS setup for project and activities. We'll then review the new activity setup requirements. We'll review the activity funding and subrecipient setup. And then last but not least, we will identify some resources for the ESG and ESG-CV programs that will help ensure that you have success with IDIS. Next slide. Just a few reminders to make sure that you're informed of the latest HUD guidance. Sign up for the ESG listserv for regular updates and guidance that we release on a regular basis. Also, visit the ESG guidance for COVID-19 on the HUD Exchange. You'll see those links there. It is now my pleasure to hand off the presentation to Marlisa Grogan from SNAPS to get us started.
To be with you all today. Depending on where you are in your process for rolling out your ESG CARES Act grant, one of the first steps that you will or would have taken is submitting your annual action plan or substantial amendment that covers your CARES Act funding. The instructions for setting up a substantial amendment or including your CARES Act funds in your annual action plan is provided here on the screen, linked to in this slide, and we go over the step-by-step process for setting up your project and for all of the fields that you absolutely need to complete in order to have a substantially complete substantial amendment or annual action plan. One of the key takeaways in that guidance is that you will only be creating one project for ESG in program year 2020 that's going to include both your fiscal year 2020 annual ESG grant as well as your CARES Act ESG-CV grant. and this is only applicable to the HESG grant path. So ESG is very different from the other formula programs, namely CDBG and HOPWA, with this fact. So there's only one HESG project, and that is going to be associated or can be associated with more than one annual action plan in IDIS, depending on how you submitted your consolidated plan submission. The example that we provide right here is you could have a fiscal year 20 project associated with both the fiscal year 19 annual action plan if you're submitting your CARES Act grant through your fiscal year 2019 substantial amendment. And then you could also have your fiscal year 20 annual action plan associated through the fiscal year 20 annual ESG grant. So you can see how submitting your fiscal year 20 annual ESG grant through your fiscal year 20 annual action plan, you're associating the 2020 project to both a fiscal year 20 annual action plan as well as a fiscal year 19 annual action plan. Next slide, please. So here's a bit of a visual for the way the HESG project is set up. Again, there's just one fiscal year 2020 HESG project, and the naming convention that you'll want to follow is there in the first blue bubble, ESG 20 with your jurisdiction name. And then under that fiscal year 2020 HESG project, you have your fiscal year 20 annual ESG grant, which you will, in all cases, associate with your fiscal year 20 annual action plan. And then you also have your ESG-CV grant, both round 1 and round 2, and you have the choice of either associating that with your fiscal year 19 annual action plan as a substantial amendment, or you could associate it with your fiscal year 20 annual action plan. There are also deviations. We're recognizing that there are a wide variety of possibilities for where you may be in your consolidated planning submission. I think in some rare cases, you could have already submitted your fiscal year 20 annual action plan, and you may be amending that plan to include your ESG-CV grant funds. So this is just, I think, an example that shows how you can set it up, just recognizing that there could be deviations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your situation is wrong, but you can just feel free to submit an AAQ if you have any doubt about how you're setting things up. And then please just don't forget the naming convention, which we include on this slide a couple of different times. But that's going to ensure that you know exactly what you're looking for when it comes to the project itself. Next slide, please. So here is a screenshot of the project setup and the specific steps that you'll need to follow. You are going to, when you're on the project, the Add Project screen, you're either going to be selecting 2020 as the program year for your 2020 project, if you've already set it up, or you're going to click Add New Program Year if you're first setting it up. And then in the estimated amount section, just remember, and it's highlighted here in yellow, that for HESG, ultimately you are going to have your fiscal year 20 annual ESG grant amount, as well as both rounds 1 and 2 of your ESG-CV grant. So that's all going to be under that one line item for HESG. And now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris for more information on activity setup. Chris?
Thanks, Marlisa. Let's talk a little bit about ESG-CV activity setup within IDIS. You will follow the process for activity setup on the Add Plans Project Activities screen. You're going to associate it with that project that Marlisa just mentioned on the AP35 screen. This year, we're going to sum each activity's funding. The sum will include activities from each of the funding from the ESG-CV and the annual FY20 ESG program funding. As you see here, we have ESG-CV funding for rapid rehousing. We have the annual fiscal year 2020 ESG funding for rapid rehousing. So in the activity project stream, we will have The ESG-20 will cover both ESG-CV and regular ESG in one activity, as you see here. Next screen. As a reminder, in IDIS for the ESG and ESG-CV programs, there is only one fiscal year 20 activity per component. You can only have one of each of these. You cannot have two, which will include funding from both the annual fiscal year 2020 ESG and the ESG-CV grants. The only ESG activities that may be set up are, as you see here, ESG-20 street outreach, ESG-20 shelter, ESG-20 rapid rehousing, ESG-20 homeless prevention, ESG-20 data collection, HMIS, and ESG administration. If you set up anything other than that, it is not right, and it will not work. This year, more than ever, it is important that you set up activities correctly and track your funding correctly, as we have both annual ESG-20 and ESG-CV in the same activities. So it's very, very critical you set things up and are able to draw things correctly. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder about the grant-based accounting principles we have in IDIS for the ESG and now ESG-CV programs, funds are set up and drawn in IDIS on a grant-specific basis. So as you see here in the graphic, we have walls between the 2019 annual ESG. We also have a wall between the 2020 annual ESG and the 2020 ESG-CV grants. In past years, long ago, this was not the case. We had different types of accounting methods. This is the only accounting method that we want. We want everything in its own specific grant year. ESG recipients will continue to align projects and activities with the same grant year through the funding process. Following proper setup, ESG-CV grant is drawn separately from the FY20 annual ESG grant, and we'll show you that in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. Here are just a few reminders for the ESG and ESG-CV activities. First, recipients must enter a narrative in IDIS activity description that identifies the ESG-CV funding and how that activity prevents, prepares for, or responds to COVID-19. That is extremely important for ESG-CV. If you are using a prior fiscal year, so fiscal year 19 or 18 or earlier funding allocation, the activity description must be updated to include a narrative description IDIS specific to the annual funding and how it is to be used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus or COVID-19. Note that we encourage you to use old ESG funds readily. Use that money. It's there. Don't let it expire. Use those funds, and if you're going to use it for coronavirus, just edit those descriptions to be very clear on what it is you're doing as far as that activity is concerned. With that, I'll hand things back to Marlisa.
Hi, everybody. So we are going to go over the documentation requirements for preparing, preventing, and responding to coronavirus, which is done on the activity description screen in IDIS. So the ESG-CV notice requires that that recipients document for each of your activities funded with ESG-CV or annual ESG that's being used for coronavirus response, that you put in your activity description how those activities are connected to your coronavirus response. So in the event that you are setting up a 2020 activity, you're going to want to make sure to separate out the annual ESG funds for your fiscal year 2020 activity from your ESG-CV funds. You're also going to want to separate out your annual ESG for non-COVID response from your annual ESG for COVID response. On this slide, we've shown an example of how to set up your activity description if you are, for example, using fiscal year 2019 annual ESG funds for coronavirus response. So here you have the portion of your fiscal year 19 activity that's being used for non-COVID response, which is $50,000 from the emergency shelter activity, which had been already budgeted for shelter operations and quite possibly has already been expended. And then for annual ESG COVID response, you go into detail about how much money is going to be used from that 2019 emergency shelter activity that you're reprogramming for coronavirus response. And then in this example, we explain that the funds are going to be used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus by enhancing shelter sanitation per local public health infection control guidelines, and that funds are also going to be used for personal protective equipment and hygiene supplies. So just due to the inherent nature of ESG activities, it's not a stretch for how sheltering people, rehousing people, keeping people housed can minimize infection and protect others from infection as well. So, but documentation is really important. Even if you think that it's an obvious connection, make sure that you're putting together the notation for preventing, preparing for, and responding to coronavirus, along with the actual ESG activity. Just another note that you do not need to go, the level of documentation does not need to be at the individual or household level. We're not looking for like a positive test result or information about job loss due to COVID. It's really at this activity or component level. And then it's also really important to maintain in your program or project files the adequate documentation that shows when your community began responding to coronavirus, so that you can substantiate the date that you're going back to, not earlier than January 21st, 2020, but the date that your community started responding to coronavirus. Next slide, please. And before I turn it over to Heidi, we're just going to go over the new eligible activities that have been established in the ESG-CV notice. These will look familiar to you, and we've included how you should be categorizing them under the IDIS activity category. There are no new activities that have been set up, so you want to budget these additional eligible activities under the existing components. So temporary emergency shelter should be budgeted under shelter. Training can go under any of the component types except HMIS. Hazard pay can also go under any of the components. Hand washing stations and portable bathrooms under street outreach. Landlord incentives can go under homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, and volunteer incentives can also go under prevention, rapid rehousing, shelter, or street outreach. So we have not set up new activity types for these, and it's also a really good idea when you're intending to use these new eligible activities to just identify the ones that you're funding in the activity description. And then also be aware that on the back end for CAPER reporting, we do ask you to report out on expenditures for these line items specifically. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Heidi.
Thank you, Marlisa. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I just wanted to build off of what Marlisa was saying and now start taking this down to the next level. So in terms of that activity funding, I wanted to go through a few of the basic components for doing that in IDIS before we get into a demonstration and everyone can see the screens themselves. One of the most important parts of funding an activity in IDIS, remember those activities, street outreach, shelter, homelessness prevention, and so forth, is when you get to the activity funding screen, is identifying the very specific subrecipient, provider, entity that is actually carrying out the activity themselves. So if you are a state, it's not unheard of for on your emergency shelter activity to show 60 plus subrecipients, and you will include what those specific subrecipients are funded for. Because when you come down to drawing an IDIS, you're going to draw at that level of specificity. When you go into IDIS on that activity funding screen, there's going to be two options. There's going to be one option that says carry-out organization. There's another option that says subordinate organization. for the vast majority of ESG recipients, use the subordinate organization. That tends to be how these subrecipient organizations were first entered into IDIS, starting back with this HESG grant path in 2011. So, there's a history there of providers being listed. Most of them are under the subordinate organization. A few are under carryout, but more often than not, they're under the subordinate organization listing. If you have any questions or you love screenshots, there are step-by-step instructions in the ESG IDIS manual, and Section 6 specifically refers to funding and identifying those subrecipients in IDIS. One more reason that this is really important, it not only tells HUD who are your providers, what are they doing, what level of funding do they have, but it also, this is the mechanism on your IDIS CAPER, which you're due, typically is due in IDIS 90 days after the end of your program year, is on that CR60 screen, there will be a mechanism to bring in your subrecipients, the entities that you have identified on the funding screen. This is how those listing of organizations gets populated. So if you do not identify your subrecipients on the activity funding screen, when it comes to the end of year reporting in IDIS through the CAPER, you won't have any subrecipients listed there. So it's really, really, really important to identify your subrecipients. That's how you're going to tell HUD who you're working with. It's how you're going to identify when you're drawing funds down, and then it's going to help you in your year-end reporting on the CAPER. Moving on from that, taking a step back and looking at grant numbers. This is really different in 2020. I don't know how often we can say that, but each ESG recipient is going to have 2 HESG grants in the grant year 2020. And maybe you like looking at your grant numbers with such a fine-tooth comb, and you've picked up on this already, but if you haven't, we have this chart for you. There is going to be a very minor difference in your grant number. If you are a state, your formula grant, your fiscal year 2020 grant will include the letters DC in that grant number. For your ESG-CV grant, your CARES grant, it will include DW. Instead of a DC, you'll see a DW. Metro cities will change from, we'll have 2 grants again. One will say MC, the other will say MW. Territories will have an ST and then an SW for the ESG-CV grant. And finally, urban counties will see a UC for their formula grant and a UW for their ESG-CV grant. We're absolutely going to highlight this again when we're in IDIS, and we have a few screenshots sprinkled throughout the way to help reiterate this. This screenshot will be included in the IDIS manual once it's published after this webinar, hopefully, here soon. So just what I was talking about with those grant numbers. So here we have one particular grantee. There are 2 grants for 2020. The first one, the first row, indicates here, highlighted in yellow, the MW. That's the ESG-CV grant for that metro city. The second grant indicates in the source type an MC, and that indicates that that's the fiscal 20 annual grant for this city. So that's where you really are going to have to pay attention to the grant numbers. It's going to be absolutely paramount when you are funding your activities and drawing your activities that you select the right grant. And we're going to keep coming back into that. So now I am hopefully not going to break this, and I'm going to take everyone over to what is called the IDIS UAT, or the IDIS User Acceptance Training Environment. This is an environment that is available to grantees, and they can go in here and practice in IDIS. Just to explain, this environment is typically updated once every month or so. So if you immediately after this webinar, you might notice things look a little different. Your particular organization's activities might have been set up in IDIS very recently, and that setup may not have carried over to the UAT environment. So don't be alarmed if you log into UAT, and things look a little different. So the first thing I wanted to do in UAT was go to the grant tab. And here I want to specifically take a look at my organization that I've logged in as. I want to take a look at their 2020 HESG grant. So I'm going to hit search. And there you go. I have 2 grants. Now, I know we can't all come off mute and ask the participants to list which grant is which, but we know just from looking at that previous chart that the formula grant is here. It is that MC grant number. There's an MC here in the grant. That is the Formula 2020 grant. The MW grant, that MW source type, indicates that this is the organization's CARES grant, the ESG-CV grant. I know we use a lot of those words interchangeably. So as talking earlier with the substantial amendment process, a lot of grantees submitted a substantial amendment initially for that first ESG allocation, and then submitted later on down the road a second substantial amendment for that second ESG allocation. Even though there were 2 ESG-CV allocations, you'll only see 1 ESG grant here for the CV, again, with the particular source type for your organization, depending if you're a state, an urban county, a metro city, or a territory. This grant amount for your ESG-CV fund will be increased by HUD in IDIS. Again, if your organization submitted 1 substantial amendment and then a second for that ESG second allocation. Some organizations submitted 1 application later on for both allocations, so they wouldn't see that grant amount increase. So I just wanted to make that very, very clear. So for 2020, you'll have 2 HESG grants, 1 for your fiscal allocation and 1 for your CARES allocation. While we're here on this particular tab of IDIS, this grant tab in IDIS, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and go over to the sub-fund component. This is not something that we've talked about yet, but will be mentioned a little bit later on in the presentation. So here, for your administration activities in IDIS, ESG recipients have always had to set up what is called an AD, or an administration sub-fund. And that is a mechanism in IDIS to ensure that your organization did not exceed the cap on administration funding. So previously for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, it was 7.5% cap. And for many of you recipients, you know that IDIS would pinpoint that to the penny. For ESG, for the CV funds, it's a 10% cap if you're using those funds to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. So here, I'm going to take a look and search for my 2020 sub-funds and walk through this process a little bit. Now, the EN, the entitlement fund type, is automatically set up in IDIS when your grant is loaded. You have to do nothing as an ESG recipient. And you can see you can do nothing. Your options are just view. There's no option for you. As an ESG recipient, if you are going to use any funding for admin, which I would venture a guess most of you are going to use admin funding, you have to, as an organization, set up this AD subfund. So we can see here, the MC subfund for AD has been set up so far by the organization. This again, Metro City, this is the formula grant subfund for AD. There is not a second AD subfund here like there is for EN. So we are actually going to go ahead and we are going to add that subfund right now. And I wanted to take the time to do this just so that everyone could see that designation. In order to add this subfund, you have to do this activity, or someone from your organization has to do this. So we're just going to hope this works. We're going to add this fund type. That looks good. We can see it's my CARES grant funding because it's got that MW source type in it. We're going to add this fund. And now this is going to tell me This is going to give me 10% of my grant amount, and so I'm just going to copy and paste that. If your organization was using less than 10%, you absolutely can use less than 10% here. But again, that would be identified most likely in your organization's, annual allocation and your action plan. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. My subfund has been added, and now I can see if I go to ESG, I'm just going to look for, make sure it shows up here. And there you go. Now I have those two subfunds. I just wanted to take a few minutes and identify that, because for most organizations, you're used to setting up an AD subfund, but again, for this year, because there are 2 grants, you'll need to set up 2 subfunds for AD, because the subfund is at the grant level. So this is a little bit different this year, as with most things, but I really wanted to highlight, if you are going to charge admin to both of your grants, you will need to set up 2 subfunds. I don't know if there are any questions related to the AD subfund. If no one jumps in, I'm going to go over to the plans, projects, and activities.
Actually, hi.
Sure.
Oh, Heidi, can you hear me? There is a question about the AD subfund.
Perfect.
The question is, I apologize to everyone for the ill-timed frog in my throat there. Okay, the question is the AD subfund for the grantee administration only, or is any administration allowed to the subrecipients?
So the subfund itself is for all of the administration funds. And what that means is, in order to fund an admin activity in IDIS, this AD fund type must exist. And that first thing that we did, or that I did, was add it. We needed to create it. So if your organization is going to share your up to 10% admin costs with one of your providers or some of your providers or lots of your providers, you'll create one AD subfund for your CARES grant. When it comes to funding the admin activity, that's where then you'll identify those other organizations. And so the AD subfund is to really take a pot of your money away and designate it for admin. And it's to ensure that you don't go over that 10% cap for the CARES funding. It's nice to see it with 10% because it makes the math quite easy. You can see just the decimal point moved. And so it's a way to set aside that funding to ensure that grantees don't exceed that 10% cap. How was that? Did I answer your question, Nora? Perfect. Awesome.
I think so.
Thank you so much. Awesome. All right. So once again, rather than hitting my back button, because never hit your back button in IDIS, it causes all sorts of issues. So just pretend it doesn't even exist there. I'm going to go over to plans, projects, and activities. I'm not going to go through the annual action plan, but that's where you would find your consolidated plan, your annual action plan, your consolidated annual performance evaluation report, otherwise known as the CAPER. Yes, there is a CAPER for ESG in IDIS, but all of these features of the Econ Planning Suite are available here under Plans, Projects, and Activities. If you log into IDIS and you don't see them, talk to your local IDIS grantee administrator. You most likely don't have that user privilege, and with a few clicks of a button, they can give you access to them if you need access and should have access, I should say. Sometimes less is more. So here, what I want to do first, instead of diving into the annual action plan and looking at the AP 35 screen, as Chris was talking about earlier, once that project is created on the AP 35 screen, it will appear in the project screen, and which is what most people are, if you're in IDIS often enough, are used to seeing. So I'm going to take a look at 2020. I'm going to pick HESG, and I'm going to hit search. And sure enough, I have just one HESG project for 2020. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to view this project. So I can see I've got a project description. It goes down. That's wonderful. But really, by designating this funding here on this HESG line, that's how this project gets its designation as an HESG project. And we can see here, that is the total sum of the organization's 2020 allocation, their ESG-CV1 allocation, and their ESG-CV2 allocation. I probably didn't show that screen earlier to show all that, but trust me, the numbers don't lie. This represents those three different pots of money, if you will. And with this, I'm going to go ahead and down here, I'm going to go ahead and just click View Activity. And this is going to bring me to all of the activities that were listed in that project. So you can see the program year and the project ID is the same. All of these activities have been assigned to this one HESG activity. This organization has set up activities for shelter, street outreach, data collection, homeless prevention, rapid rehousing, and administration. So just as Chris was saying earlier, they have 6 eligible activity components in IDIS. They have 1 activity for each of those eligible components. You don't see an activity that says hand washing station. You don't see an activity name that says, training, hazard pay, volunteer incentive, landlord incentive. As Marlisa was talking about earlier, those costs are grouped with the higher up, larger ESG activity category in IDIS. So far, so good there, or should we take a question? All right, I'm going to go ahead, and again, if there are any questions, please feel free to jump in. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the rapid rehousing activity. So again, once an activity is created in IDIS, it will be given its own unique sequential ID. This particular grantee, this is not a required field, this grantee PJ activity ID. The grantee can enter something in here, and they did. And they most likely did this to correspond with their internal financial records. So that's a great suggestion and a great tip. It's not required. IDIS will give you an activity ID in a sequential order for your organization. My activity name is here. It's rapid rehousing. I'm following the naming convention that was identified earlier. And down below, I've got this Excel-looking table, and I can see my activity category is not listed on the ESG line. It's on the HESG line, because again, for the HEARTH Emergency Solutions Grants Program, we're using HESG and have been in IDIS since the 2011 grant year. My activity category was selected as rapid rehousing. There are just a few minor setup details that are needed for ESG or for HESG, and all it is you click the performance objective, you confirm the performance objective, the performance outcome, and the secondary activity categories. You don't have to include an address. It's not necessary. It's not a required field. You'd hit save, and your activity would now show in this column as ready to fund. So if you're setting up an activity in IDIS and you see a no, like all of these other lines in this line, it just means you have to finish the setup details for HESG. It's not a lot of information. We understand ESG recipients are doing a lot of data and performance, and a lot of data is in homeless programs. It's not in IDIS. We're not looking for that level of specificity here in IDIS. You'll include the environmental review, its particular status. If your organization uses HEROES, you can connect to that system and include your environmental review here. But I did want to highlight here this last piece, this activity description. As Marlisa identified earlier, in the ESG-CV notice, it was required that you as a ESG recipient include a description in IDIS stating how your organization will be using this funding to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. So here, it's at a very high level, providing rental assistance to individuals and families who are literally homeless to reduce the risk of COVID-19 infection. Rapid rehousing funds will be used to provide housing stability, case management, and financial assistance costs as needed. will utilize landlord and volunteer incentives on an as-needed basis. So again, as Marlisa was saying, we don't need a positive test result here. We're not looking for information on individuals here. It's a more broad description, but it does speak to how your organization will be using this particular activity to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. Any questions at this moment about that activity setup?
Yeah, there's a question about activity setup and the if we should have an activity under the project page and it's not listed, can it be added after the annual action plan substantial amendment has been submitted?
So there is a project that's not listed on the annual action plan?
The question is about an activity under the project page not listed. Can it be added later?
The project is listed in the annual action plan, but the activity isn't. Most likely the activity can be added. It would just most likely need to be confirmed that it's assigned to the correct project. Again, on that project screen, if funding was not identified on that very specific HESG line, then that project would not read as an HESG project, and we can see that happening with grantees as they submit that additional substantial amendment, where they'll create a second project and then don't identify it as an HESG project. So that could happen. But really what you would need to do is if the activities were not showing up, they're most likely assigned to an incorrect project. And what you would do is you would click here and you would change the project and assign them to the correct project.
Fantastic. Another question about how do you add multiple subrecipients to an activity?
That was a fantastic question because someone, Nora, make sure you thank them for me, just gave me the perfect segue into talking about activity funding. So the first step, or this particular first step, is to set up your activity. Make sure that the setup details are here. This activity says ready to fund. You can either click activity funding here, or you can go up to the funding and drawdown screen. And this is where you are going to identify those subordinate organizations. So now we've switched from plans, projects, activities. We've gone over to funding and drawdown. We are going, the default option here is search activities to fund. So we are going to look at the 2020 HESG activities and add some funding. So again, we have these 6 activities. The activity numbers are the same that they were previously. That information will carry forward throughout IDIS. And I want to go and with the same rapid rehousing activities, my options, I want to add edit. This is where the details really do matter. And so now when I log into this activity, I go to edit the funding, I'm now presented with 2 lines of available funds. And this is where, again, I've got to pay attention to that source code. So this MC, I'm logged in right now as a Metro City. This is going to indicate the fiscal 20 ESG grant. If I have right now $16,654 available to fund for that ESG fiscal 20 grant. If I wanted to add funding to this activity for rapid rehousing funds, I would click add edit. At this moment in time, I don't want to edit the fiscal 20 grant. I want to edit the ESG-CV grant. So I'm going to look for, again, as a Metro City, I'm going to look for that MW source type. And I'm going to see, oh, there it is right there. I'm going to select add edit here. And so here, this is going to tell me a little bit more information. I started funding this activity, and now I'm going to continue funding this activity. So for this rapid rehousing activity, the organization that I am taking over today has identified $400,000 of their ESG-CV funds for rapid rehousing will go to the Salvation Army. $7,000 of those funds have been drawn. This is not an editable field in IDIS. This is going to carry over from vouchers that are created. We're going to get to those in just a few minutes. So this is where you're very specifically identifying the organizations that you are providing funding to. And I'm going to go ahead and add another subrecipient. The default option will be the grantee name, your formal HUD grantee name, and you'll go ahead, if you're selecting another organization, you're going to change that organization. The default option again here for this select subrecipient will be that subordinate category that I talked about earlier, and you can see there's this carryout organization. More often than not, the organization is going to be listed under the subordinate designation. When searching for an activity name, my suggestion is to be more brief and less and more vague. If you were going to look for St. Mary's Place and you put a period after St., you would eliminate any result that was St. Mary's Place had no period. IDIS is very specific like that, and that little tip bar will show you that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit search here. And here we go. I've got some options. I'm going to pick, I know my organization and I know the DUNS number and the EIN number. I'm going to pick this organization. I'm going to fill in this radio button here, and I'm going to select to bring that organization back to the activity funding screen. And now I can type into this funding. I have just over $1 million. I'm going to try to keep my numbers nice and round. So I'm going to add $600,000 for community rebuilders. I'm going to hit save. And I get a lovely little green message that says activity funded successfully. Don't say that we don't give positive validation in IDIS. And so now this page has changed. Before I had just over $1 million, now I have just under $500,000 because I just funded this organization for $600,000. And you could just add more organizations, again, until you were done funding this activity. So if I'm if I am funding $1 million for rapid rehousing with my ESG-CV money, I'm done. If I was going to fund additional funds to this rapid rehousing activity, I still have funds available. I could keep going. That's the level of specificity that IDIS needs for the funding screens. So you're going to identify the subrecipient. You're going to give a very specific dollar amount, and you're going to hit save. And when you come back to this funding screen, IDIS will bring in the drawn amount. Any questions at this moment?
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of questions. I think it's great information about the subrecipients. What in situations where there's a sub-recipient, like say you fund the Salvation Army as you did, but then they have subrecipients underneath them? Is there a process within these screens or other ones that recipients should be aware of that need to happen in that instance?
So in terms of IDIS, we can't add a sub to a sub. We just have one level of subrecipients. So I think I'm actually going to punt that question to Marlisa and ask her, because more often than not, it's really going to speak to the specific language in your agreement with your subrecipient. But Marlisa, do you want to weigh in on an answer on that one?
Yes. I think that we don't expect you to be carrying your subrecipient setup all the way to the lowest tier if there is a number of different layers there. So most definitely your first tier subrecipient, but if you have multiple tiers and you're directly reimbursing the first tier and then the first tier may be reimbursing the second tier, we don't expect you to be setting up like a second or a third tier in IDIS.
Perfect. All right, Nora, any other questions about this funding screen?
Not that I have queued up right now, so go forward.
Perfect. Okay. All right. I'm just going to go ahead. When in doubt, hit save. That's a good tip for IDIS. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit save and get out of here. Or I guess I can return to activity funding. And again, I'm not hitting my back button. because that's bad in IDIS. It can cause all sorts of issues. So I added funding to that rapid rehousing activity. That process would be the same for your other activities as well. So I don't want to spend the time, because I understand short attention spans. We all have very, very, very important things to do. For the admin funding, we did identify. We set up at the very beginning of this demonstration that AD subfund for the CARES grant for this organization. So we can see here now, none of that money has been funded yet. It can't be funded. We set up the subfund for it. So with the AD subfund, if we had not yet set that up, as an organization, if I came in here as a user for that grantee and tried to fund that CARES grant, I wouldn't even see it. It would be as though it did not exist at all. There would just be absolutely nothing there. So that's why it's really, really important for the administration subfund to be created for, again, both grants. I know it's a little odd. You have one project, you'll have one admin activity, 2 grants, and 2 AD subfunds. So it's the details matter, and I understand this is very different than it has been in previous years. But I did want to show that, again, there's nothing funded right now for that CARES grant because we just set up that AD subfund. So if there are no other questions about activity funding, I'm going to move on. Is that okay? Nora, are there any questions?
No, I think we're good right now.
Perfect. Okay. The very last thing that I want to show at this particular moment in time and show how important this is I want to create a voucher. If you're from Grand Rapids, Michigan, don't worry. This, again, I'm in training. I'm not drawing money for you. Don't worry. No harm, no foul. I'm in the training environment. When you come here, you can either enter in your specific activity numbers, or if you don't remember them, because that's completely fine, you can search for activities here. And you can just search by program. You can always search by a variety of different options. And so at this particular moment in time, I'm going to just draw. I'm going through the motions here. I'm just going to draw for 2 activities. Let's just draw for 2 activities so it doesn't get too complicated. I'm going to add these selected activities. It's going to take me back to this screen. If I had known those activity numbers, I could have just done that. I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. Now, this is where it gets really, really specific. So my first activity, activity 1 of 2, remember I selected 2 activity numbers. So my first activity, I now am presented with some options. I am presented with options here that are very important because this particular activity, this rapid rehousing activity, is funded with both CARES funding and fiscal 20 funding. So when creating a voucher, if you walk away with nothing else from this demonstration, it is this right here. You must draw from the correct grant. You cannot revise a voucher in IDIS from one grant to another. So when you are on this screen, this is very important to make sure that you get the source type correct. I've seen so far in IDIS, most organizations are drawing on separate vouchers. They'll have one voucher for their CARES funding and another voucher for their fiscal 20 funding. There's no right or wrong way to do that. If that works for your organization, fantastic. If your organization, nope, everything has to be on one voucher, that's fine too. This is where it's really important to pay attention to that source type. So for here, if we are going to make this voucher, just again, we're in the training environment. This is for show and tell, for demonstration purposes. I am going to have to select community rebuilders. In my invoice that I'm looking at, is it coming from the CARES grant or is it coming from the fiscal 20 grant? The documentation that I have in front of me states that it is from the CARES grant. So I am going to go ahead and look for that source type. And I'm going to draw, again, I like round numbers. So I'm going to draw $20,000 for Rebuilders of America. I also have an invoice from Salvation Army that is also for CARES funding. So I'm going to draw $30,000 for the Salvation Army. So now I'm going to go ahead and select next activity because, again, I selected 2 activities. I selected admin. At this moment in time, I have created an AD subfund for both grants. I did not, however, fund that CARES grant of funding on that admin activity. I showed the $300-ish thousand that was available for funding, but I didn't fund the admin activity. So when I create the option or create this voucher, my only option here is that MC source type. This is the fiscal 20 grant. That's my only option. Just wanted to make sure that that was crystal clear for everyone. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select confirm voucher. I'm not done yet. I've got this green message here. Right now, I don't have a voucher number. This is my opportunity to double check my own work. Okay, on this voucher, I have got funding for both the CARES grant here, the fiscal 20 grant, and then it's broken down by subrecipient. That's the level of specificity needed for a voucher. So you're drawing at the activity level. At that activity level, you're drawing the next layer down. Is it a CARES grant? Is it your fiscal 20 grant? And then the next layer down is the subrecipient level. So those things have to add up. And so, again, according to my documentation that is in front of me, I'm going to go ahead and click Generate Voucher. Now, I get a green message, love green messages, and I have a voucher number. I can then turn to someone else in my organization who has the ability to approve vouchers. Your organization most likely has a very good process for this. And so that you would go to that person, you would tell them, here's the voucher number, they would verify it in IDIS, they would approve it. The same person cannot create and approve a voucher in IDIS. Just there's a separation of duties. So make sure you've got backups, and your local grantee administrator can make those updates as needed in IDIS if someone's out, because that certainly does happen. So that's for creating a voucher. The process to revise a voucher is very, very, very similar. And really what I just want to stress is in IDIS, you cannot, as a grantee user, you cannot revise a voucher from one grant year to another. You cannot revise a voucher from admin to EN or EN to admin. And you can't revise a voucher from one grant to another. And that is very important for this 2020 grant year, because you have two grants. You have a CARES grant, which is going to have a different source type than your fiscal 20 grant. And so it's very, very important that when draws are created and approved in IDIS, verify that source type. Make sure it's coming from the right grant. Because when you go to review or approve or revise a voucher in IDIS, you are only presented with, oh, that's not a good one. Let's not do that. Let's stick with rapid rehousing. You can only revise from the same grant. You can revise an activity for your CARES grant. Say we drew down one of this voucher here. We drew this voucher down. It shows it's completed, so I could maintain approve and then revise that voucher for rapid rehousing. I could revise that voucher. I have to include this justification. I have to indicate, the subrecipient, and then I would select. I can revise it within rapid rehousing. I can revise it to another entity, the Salvation Army. I can make that revision. I can revise it to homelessness prevention. Maybe just numbers got mixed up and it's all wrong. You can revise it to another activity. You can revise it within that activity to another entity, another subrecipient. So you can make that revision as long as that activity, that subrecipient is funded. They have funds available to draw. This will populate based on the difference between what they've been funded and what's been drawn. This will populate. IDIS does the math for you. So you can make this revision. You, however, cannot make that revision to a non-CARES grant. So if you drew it with CARES money, it can be revised to another CARES eligible expense. It cannot be revised through fiscal 20 eligible expenses, and vice versa. I know that was a lot, but are there any questions about revising vouchers?
I haven't seen any questions about revising vouchers. Nope. We got a bunch of questions for you, but I think we can hold them until there's more time.
Okay. I just saw one pop up. If you created a voucher and you are going through at the very last minute and you notice that it's just all wrong, you can cancel a voucher. If it hasn't gone to locks yet, you can cancel a voucher. If it goes to locks and shows as completed, then it needs to be revised. So that's why it's really important when creating a voucher, and then again, that second person from your organization approves the voucher, really make sure that that voucher is right then and there. It's always easier to get it right the first time. That's just IDIS and mainly life. But revisions do happen, again, but it has to be from one CARES eligible expense to another CARES eligible expense, one fiscal 20 eligible expense to another fiscal 20 eligible expense. So with that, I am now done with our IDIS demo. Again, there are screenshots of all of this in the IDIS manual, and you can come into this training environment and walk through and try this out for yourself. Open up the manual and do that. I encourage you to, or you can turn to your organization's IDIS guru and just hope that they get, no, I'm kidding. They'll get it right in IDIS. It's pretty straightforward. You'll get it, I promise. But with that, I'm going to back out of this and turn the slides back over to Marlisa.
Thanks, Heidi. Before we move on, we just want to take just a brief moment to pause and then review some of the key takeaways from Heidi's live demo. First, when drawing funds for each subrecipient, make sure that recipients are drawing for each sub at the activity level, so rapid rehousing, prevention, emergency shelter, street outreach, HMIS, admin, and then recipients also need to know each subrecipient and activity associated with a draw when you're revising your voucher. So those are two important points to remember when you're drawing funds for your subs. And then next slide, please. Here is a familiar screenshot showing an IDIS voucher where a recipient drew admin funds for both fiscal year 2020 and ESG-CV on the same voucher. So you can see the different source types highlighted in yellow, DW for the ESG-CV grant, and the fiscal year 2020 annual grant is tracking separately under the DC source type. And just to note that the source type for annual grants, 2020 included, has not changed. It's the new source types that have been established for ESG-CV grants. Next slide, please. And then before I turn it over to Chris, just a reminder on this slide, these are the basic tenets for revising vouchers. So make sure that you are paying close attention here so that you're not, you don't need to make a correction or return funds. So first, revisions cannot be made between different grants. Make sure that when you're drawing and revising for ESG-CV, you're keeping it within the ESG-CV grant, and when you're drawing and revising for fiscal year 2020, that you're paying attention to the source type and then only revising for 2020 grant, for your 2020 grant. The activity status must be open to revise vouchers. You must have funds available to draw in order to revise a voucher. So if you have zero funds available, then you will not be able to revise, and that would be a time to submit an AAQ. Both activities must have the same fund type. So make sure you have your EN for your regular activities, or it's the AD admin subfund, and keep within those, so you're not revising from one to the other. Subrecipients must have funds available to draw as well, and vouchers must have a status of completed. Also remember to include required justifications, so you're basically documenting the need for revising the voucher. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Marlisa. And I think it should be noted just how difficult it is to do a live demonstration on a webinar. Heidi, congratulations. That was a fantastic job. answered tons of questions and makes the end of this webinar very easy. So before I talk about ESG data quality reminders, I just want to kind of mention something that I've thrown in the chat a few times. The structure of IDIS is we keep it fairly simple for a reason. We have one project, we have up to 6 activities, and then as many subrecipients as you need to carry out those activities. So keep that structure in mind when you're building out your IDIS. Now, as it relates to data quality in IDIS, that is always important, and this year is no exception with the fact that we have annual fiscal year 2020 ESG and ESG-CV in the same project. That means the data quality is paramount. So I'm going to talk about a few things here. Activity naming convention is key. So we saw what the activity naming should be, ESG-20 and the activity name. Activities are to be funded with one grant source year of funding. We do not want to cross that. That goes against the principles we have for our grant-based accounting. Any reprogrammed funds, which recapture funds from an activity, that must stay within the same program year. I saw this question a few times in the chat as well. A lot of times we put the full 10% or the 7.5% for admin away in the beginning. We carved that out as a sub-fund, and as we get closer to the end, we didn't need all that admin. It is possible for your admin to get trapped. So you can't just like most activities say, okay, we're going to reallocate that money. You have to go into the admin sub-fund and lower the sub-fund amount before you can reallocate those funds. If you go to section 5.2 of the ESG IDIS manual, which I dropped in the chat to Roberta not too long ago, you can see that exact process, shot by shot, how that goes. Also, revise your vouchers. Do all of your accounting prior to completing the drawdowns. You don't want to get into a situation where you have to send money back to be able to revise vouchers. That is, takes a lot of time, it's a lot of hassle, and you don't want to do that. So refer to this, the ESG activity closeout checklist, for more information on that. Next slide, please. Let's not forget the administrative caps, the shelter and street outreach caps. These are very important, these expenditure caps. We have them for a reason, and this year we don't have the controls we had in IDIS for 2019 and prior. So remember that the administrative cap for ESG-CV funding is 10%, and that is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. Recipients also must assure that their annual ESG that is capped at 7.5% is not exceeded. Typically, we have a mechanism in there that doesn't allow you to go beyond 7.5%. But because we have this new 10% for ESG-CV, that control has been removed, which means you are responsible for making sure that you don't exceed 7.5 or 10%. And if you do exceed those caps, returning of funds is possible. So be very, very careful with administrative caps. Now, when it comes to the 60% cap on street outreach and emergency shelter, this has also been removed for program year 2020 in IDIS. So make sure that you do not exceed the 20% cap for non-COVID related responses. If you are utilizing street outreach and emergency shelter funds from a prior year, update those activities to say how you're preparing, preventing, or responding to COVID. You see it here in red letters, and I'm going to say it again. You have to manually calculate the caps. Do not make mistakes here. We do not have the controls on the admin caps we once did, which means you are at a compliance risk and could make a mistake that could cause the repayment of funds. Next slide, please. So you're not alone. We have resources for you for ESG and ESG-CV as it relates to IDIS. So we'll just go over a few of them here on this slide and the next slide. You can always request technical assistance at the HUD Exchange and on the link you see here. We get a lot of questions through the HUD Ask a Question or the AAQ. Certainly if you have a technical question or something about what Heidi presented on the middle of this presentation, an Ask a Question is very appropriate. We also have FAQs on this page here. Next slide, please. So finally, here on the HUD Exchange, these are the landing pages for both ESG and IDIS. And good resources to have at your disposal. We have lots of information up there on how to manage your financial data for the ESG and ESG-CV program. With that, Nora, I believe we have about 20 minutes left for some question and answer, and I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. We've been firing off questions and answers fast and furious in the chat, but I am going to run through some of the ones either that we've seen a couple times or that we held to be able to respond to in this section. So I'm going to do a little bit of a round robin. If you hear your name called, please try to respond to the question. Heidi, first one's for you. It's about subrecipients. Can you add a new subrecipient, or do they already need to have been added previously? Or maybe just talk about the process for adding new subrecipients.
Perfect, thank you. So yes, I didn't highlight that in the demonstration, but if you are working with an entity and you have searched for that organization on the activity funding screen, under both the subordinate and the carryout, and they're not there, users with there's a specific user privilege in IDIS for add, edit, subordinate organizations. Someone with that privilege can make that addition in IDIS. It's just a few simple fields that need to be filled out. When in doubt, if you don't know who has that privilege, or you don't know if you have that privilege because you just can't find it, there's a report in IDIS called the PR30 report, and it indicates who has what privilege in IDIS. And again, the IDIS manual, not to keep harping on it, but does include specific screenshots on what is needed to add a new organization to IDIS. So absolutely, one of the things with CARES funding, grantees or ESG recipients are deepening their so-called bench and working with new providers to get these funds expended. You're probably going to have to add a new organization here or there. So those instructions are in the IDIS manual. There's lots of screenshots for you.
Fantastic. The more screenshots, the better. There were also a few questions requesting clarification about the difference between a carryout organization and a subordinate organization.
That, I'm going to take that. So that really just depends on how the organization was first entered into IDIS. Now, please keep in mind, IDIS has been operating in some way, shape, or form since 1994. So there's a lot of organizations in there. At one point in time, there was a meaningful difference between a carryout organization and a subordinate organization. At this point in IDIS, there is not a meaningful difference. So we encourage grantees to use the subordinate organization, but if you know, and just looking at previous years of funding, such and such shelter has been listed as a carryout organization every single year, keep using them as a carryout organization every single year. When you're adding new organizations, please do try to set them up as a subordinate organization. But in terms of IDIS as it stands at this particular moment in time, there is no meaningful difference between the two.
Thank you. I just had a little bit of a shock realizing that IDIS has been around as long as I've been a graduate from college. So there you go, a little bit of history there. Lots of questions about admin. Heidi, I think these are for you also. People were having trouble viewing the admin, which I know you touched on, but maybe you can just give a little bit of another summary about how to get to the admin funds, and then whether or not there needs to be an admin activity for both the ESG and the ESG-CV, or how that works between those different funds.
Okay, so first things first, with your admin, you will have one admin activity, and that admin activity can be funded with both your ESG-CV and your fiscal 20 fund. Now, in order to fund that admin activity, again, that one admin activity, you need, as an ESG recipient, you need to have set up that AD subfund for both grants. So that was the very first thing, or I take that back, the second thing we did in the demo. First, we looked to make sure that we had 2 grants under the grant tab. The second thing we did was go to the search subfund on the left menu bar, on that grant tab, and we searched for the subfunds, and we saw that there was only one AD subfund. We then created the AD subfund for the CARES grant. So you'll have one activity, one subfund for CARES, one subfund for your fiscal 20 grant, And then when you go to the activity funding, you can fund that activity with either, with probably most often than not, probably both grants. But again, that's where you will identify the very specific subordinate organizations, and you will do that on the CARES grant and on the Fiscal 20 grant. So one activity, one sub-fund per grant, so two, because you'll have two grants. I think I answered that question.
I think you did an excellent job answering that question. Thanks very much. Chris, I'm going to go back to you. This is something you talked about in your comments, but I think it was just such an important point about what if you put more money in your sub-fund than you actually find out that you need as you're going through your grant year. What options do you have at that point?
Well, the options are increase your administrative activity and spend that money, or more likely you're going to want to reallocate that funding to a different activity, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, HMIS, street outreach, emergency shelter, something like that. In which case, you have to go through the process. You have to undo the process that Heidi showed you. You have to go into the sub-fund, decrease it, and then it will be available for funding for other activities within IDIS. So anything around admin is going to circle around that sub-fund, which is just a different process than any other activity we have. So it's very important to remember that.
Great, thank you. All roads lead to the sub-fund. We're going to switch gears a little bit. Ben, we have a question out there about amendments and action plans. So I'll just read the question so I make sure I get it correct. If we amended our 2019 annual action plan for round 1 of ESG-CV and amended our 2020 annual action plan for round 2 of ESG-CV, will we run into IDIS issues? Maybe Ben doesn't have audio right now. Does someone else want to?
Hey, can you hear me?
We can, loud and clear.
Okay, sorry. I think just as a best practice, it's best to amend the same action plan for both the CV1 and CV2 allocations just to avoid confusion among splitting up the two allocations between different action plans. That's why there's no confusion on the field office end on what action plan amendment they're looking at, and for on the grantee end too. But if there were two amendments, one for CV1, one for CV2, and one was the 2019 and one was the 2020, from a system perspective, I don't believe there'll be any system issues, especially for ESG, as long as the same project is used. Only one project can be used for a grant year. So that same project would be on both the 2019 amendment and the 2020 amendment. I think where the confusion will arise is, if you're entering how to enter the expected resources, the amount for that. I think one thing, if you are working in two separate program years for amendments, it's important to keep in mind that you still need to put in the total for estimated amount, the total amount of the 2020 ESG regular funds, the ESG CV1 funds, and the CV2 funds. That has to be entered in the estimated amount. But depending on your amendment, if your 2020 amendment might have different expected resources on the project screen than the 2019 amendment for the CV1 funds.
Fantastic. Boy, am I glad you were able to come off mute to answer that one. Marlisa, I think I have a couple for you. One, I think you just answered really quickly in the chat about whether or not there's a commitment deadline, but if you could speak to a commitment deadline for ESG-CV funds, and if there is any difference in the priorities between ESG-CV1 and ESG-CV2.
Yes, so we don't have a commitment deadline per se, so there's not a deadline for getting your funds committed in IDIS. The regulatory requirements are for for recipients to obligate within a certain time frame, depending on whether you're a state or local government. And then, and I think Ben did a good job answering that question about the obligation deadlines in the chat. And then the ESG regulations identify how you can meet the obligation requirements. So through an award letter or other MOU, depending on how you're obligating those funds or carrying them out directly as the. So please check out the ESG regs. I think it's 576.202 for the obligation requirements, and then the expenditure deadline across the board is September 30th, 2022 for all ESG-CV grants. And there aren't any limitations or requirements for how you spend your round 1 versus round 2 allocations. We tried to get out round 1 funding as quickly as possible, and those funds were really intended for immediate COVID response, so getting people out of congregate shelter settings, like decompressing shelters, making sure that people are moved unsheltered situations to non-congregate shelter settings to make sure people are not losing their housing or getting rehoused as quickly as possible. So for those immediate needs, and then round 2 came later, and we were hoping to align that with the ESG-CV notice so that communities had more time to think about strategic allocation of resources. But statutorily and regulatorily, there are no limitations or requirements for you to use your one set of funds any differently from your other set. So just to clear that up. I think that was it. Nora, unless I missed anything. Yep.
Marlisa, I kind of have a follow-on to the obligation conversation. Though we don't have obligation deadlines within IDIS, we do have draw requirements of quarterly draws. So because there's a lot to set up and a lot to manage between obligation and actually drawing down funds, there is kind of an urgency to it. It's not a deadline per se, but there are a lot of things you have to do before you can meet that quarterly draw requirement. So I just wanted to kind of make sure folks remember that.
Yep, that's a good point. And then the PR93 would be a good place to go to see if you're tracking well on that. Although the PR91 is a good resource as well to see how your expenditure rate is shaping up.
That's great. Thanks for that. So then I have a little bit of a follow-up. Sorry, did you have something to add, Heidi?
I was just going to add, Marlisa mentioned the PR91 report, and it is a report that will help kind of track to see where you are. And for that report, you would run it separately. There are now 2 versions of it. There's one for your CARES grant, and there's one for your other fiscal year grant. So again, that would really help identify which funds are where and making sure that you're drawing funds from the correct grant in IDIS.
Fantastic, thanks. And what, I throw this open to whoever wants to respond, what's a great resource for recipients who are recognizing that, hey, with all of these changes, we might have to, down the road, do some budget amendments. We might have to be doing some things around. We had, an hour and a half to talk about how to set things up. That's great. What happens when I need to change it? So what are some good resources for people who are thinking about how they can keep up with the changes that they might have to have within IDIS for subrecipients?
I guess I'll take a stab, and then please others feel free to jump in. I think, in terms of keeping up with the changes, remembering that first and foremost for grantees, your citizen participation plan is really going to identify whether or not a substantial amendment is needed to reallocate funds. That's paramount. In terms of IDIS, activity for one subrecipient to another, you have to have funding available. So you have to, if you're going to move funds, I'm just from community rebuilders that we utilized earlier today. If we're going to move funds under rapid rehousing from community rebuilders to the Salvation Army, we first have to reduce the funded amount for community rebuilders. That will then increase the amount of funding that is now available in IDIS. Maybe previously it was zero because you fully funded your activity. Now you'll have funding available. You can then increase that to the Salvation Army under rapid rehousing. So that would be how you'd make that change between the same activity. If you were making that change, rapid rehousing to homelessness prevention, you would have to reduce first in order to have funding available for that second activity. So then you would reduce community rebuilders under rapid rehousing, hit save, and then go into the homelessness prevention activity. If you haven't identified community builders there yet, because they weren't originally an organization doing homelessness prevention, you would add them as a subrecipient or a subordinate organization there on the funding screen. If they were already listed there, you could, in that box that you can type in, you could increase the funding amount there and then go ahead and hit save.
Great, thanks. Heidi, another question I think for you about subrecipients that have been set up in multiple times in IDIS with names that are very close but a little bit different. Like in your example, you had the one with period and then not. Is there a report that can be run, or is there a way to do some clean up to try to get that under control?
There is not, unfortunately, a great report. What I would encourage you to do as an organization would be to run the PR91 report. There is a section of the PR91 report that will list the amount funded and drawn for each of your subordinate organization, your subrecipients, carry-out organizations, however they're listed. With a critical lens, look at how your organization identified that subrecipient in a previous year and try to be consistent. Duplicate subordinate organizations is a long-standing quirk of IDIS, and hopefully one day someone will be able to fix it. It's on the proverbial wish list. It hasn't happened yet. But just be mindful, especially as you are funding an organization with more than one activity, try to be consistent. When in doubt, be consistent. And just, try to jot down somewhere in your notes, which organization you're listing. Because it is very easy to just click add subrecipient and add a whole new entity and not realize that there's 10 of the same organization listed. I wish I had a better answer, but that's unfortunately the answer we have right now.
Yeah, Heidi, just to add on to that, we talked about the data quality section, and this is like any other database. The more things you add in there that are duplicative, the more difficult it's going to be for yourself. So, as a best practice, and I think you demonstrated this very well, you go into that screen and you search the organization name as little as you can under carryout and under subordinate and see if you can't find it. Because if you can find it, it's obviously one, faster, and two, you're not making duplication in the database. So really important, I think, to save yourself some time and energy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heidi. I like that you referred to that as a quirk of IDIS, which shows how much your regard for the system. We have 2 minutes left. So many good questions. I think I'll use the final 2 minutes to see if there's, Marlisa, if you have any closing comments or other key takeaways that you want to make sure get conveyed in the last 2 minutes.
I did want to just let everyone know that we are working on finalizing the IDIS manual for ESG that reflects, just these setup procedures and covers. You can use it as a reference as well as this webinar, but to do all of the activity, project setup, and then making sure that you're accounting for the different grant types when you're setting up your vouchers, when you're revising vouchers, making your draws. So you'll have that shortly. And I just wanted to thank everybody for being here and participating and being conscientious about how you're administering your grant in IDIS. And I want to thank my other presenters, especially Heidi, for that really awesome live demonstration, as well as all of the resource advisors who were nailing the questions in the background. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Nora, to close us out.
Thanks, and thanks to everyone. And just to let everyone know, the materials as far as the webinar, The chat, the slides, and then the recording will be posted to HUD's web page. That usually happens in a couple days, so that resource will be available to you to refer to, and also, refer to as you go through the process. Be sure to, as questions continue to arise, that's what the Ask a Question is for. Please don't be shy about submitting your questions. We know that you never are. So with that, we thank you for your attention, your work, and all the efforts that we know everyone is going through to manage these funds, which really are so crucial to housing and serving people during the pandemic. So thanks very much, and we will see you on the next webinar.